I'm Derek Bateman. We have a guest who's returning here. We had Billy Kay during the referendum, and he's returned now that we're post-referendum. Billy's interest is Scottish history. I suppose we made history of a kind in September, Billy?
We almost made... September 18th is still... I'm still grieving for September 18th, like a lot of people. I still find it hard to come to terms with it in some ways. I'm buoyed by the surge towards yes parties since then, but it'll take me a while to go over the shock of just... September 19th was the worst day of my life by far.
Really?
Yeah, without doubt.
And I mean, just briefly, can you explain why that is, though? I mean, what is it? Is it just a deeply personal thing? Is it something about the Scottish nation or the event itself?
It was, well, frustration in that I think if the media had been even-handed, I think the yes side would have walked it. So there's that frustration that in a way we were done out of it to a certain extent. But also it says something negative about the Scottish nation, about me and my people, that a majority voted against Scottish independence. And that's, if you're promoting Scottish culture, I think that's quite a hard thing to come to terms with.
That sounds like a kind of national embarrassment almost.
It was the ultimate expression of the Scottish cringe that we didn't get a yes vote in that referendum. But it's changing and it's coming yet for all that.
We did have problems with the media, there's no doubt, but it is up to every individual, isn't it, to make up their own mind. I mean, people have to be aware of what the media is telling them, whether they're being manipulated, whether they're getting... it is up to each individual. I mean, sometimes I think that us in the chattering classes like to tell or assume what people should think and how they respond. But the stark reality is it's a democracy. Everybody has one vote.
Yes.
And you have no obligation to tell anybody beforehand. You don't have to find out anything you don't want to find out. Your duty is to go in there and put the cross in a box, and that's it. That's our process.
Yeah, I think it's because also I am so positive about Scotland and Scotland's contribution to the world that it's almost outrageous that we don't want to be independent, because everything we've done throughout our history has been above average, has been beyond the pale, has been stronger than a small nation has any right to do. So combined with that, you wonder how deep the malaise was that produced this attitude. And you can go into the history of our education, etc., etc.
Right. However, you've got over it sufficiently to have some new projects, because you've never stopped really working on Scottish history and language. What's your latest project?
Well, I'm making some interesting documentaries for the BBC on the Scots in Russia.
We don't mention the BBC here.
I'm making some interesting projects about the Scots in Russia, which is a long-term interest. My son actually lives in Moscow, so I've got a native guide there. But the historic connections are profound and go back to people like Patrick Gordon, the Tsar's right-hand man, Scottish intellectuals and doctors who went there and treated the various Tsars and introduced Western medicine to Russia, etc., etc. So I'm working on that just now.
I always think of it, if you say Scots in Russia historically, I kind of think mercenaries, soldiers of fortune. Is that wrong?
Some of them were. Tam Dalyell's people were out there. Tam Dalyell of the Bins is supposed to have brought back the thumbscrew to Scotland to replace our native wonderful instrument of torture, which was the boot. He brought the thumbscrew back, and I interviewed Tam for the programme. He's still in good form in the Bins. But they were also replaced later on with products of the Scottish Enlightenment, brilliant intellectuals, and eventually by industrialists. People from the Claret company in Falkirk went to Russia and established ironworks and steelworks. For example, just now in the Ukraine, the great industrial area, the Donbass, a lot of that was started up by Scottish engineers who started in the Claret company in Falkirk. So there's been an ongoing thing. And then there was in more recent times, in the 20th century, huge connection between left-wing Scots and the Russian Revolution, with people like John Maclean and McManus, whose plaque is in Red Square in Moscow. And my mother came from the little Moscow of Bow Hill in West Fife, and her earliest memory was being taught the words of the Red Flag by her uncle, a miner in Bow Hill. So, and I've interviewed old miners who literally were waiting on the Russian ships arriving in Methil back in 1917 and 18. And of course,
to bring the revolution.
To bring the revolution. So there's a strong left-wing connection with Russia that is fascinating as well.
Do we know why? I mean, originally, historically, before the communist days, long before that, I mean, why were Scots drawn there? Is there a reason for that? Was that through the Baltic, for example? So we used to trade with the Baltic.
It was through the Baltic trade. It was through a general migration to Scandinavia and to the Baltic. And, for example, a classic example is a Scottish soldier of fortune called Lermonth, who arrived in Poland, fought with the Poles, moved further east, and ended up as a soldier in Russia and changing his name from Lermonth to Lermontov. So Mikhail Lermontov, the great Russian romantic writer, is a descendant of one of these Scots. And one of the astonishing things is that I found in all of my work on the Scottish diaspora is that these families know who they are. And one of the reasons for that is the great Scottish tradition of the democratic intellect, of people learning to read and write from the Reformation onwards. So they kept their family records. So I'm interviewing people in Gdansk in Poland. I'll be interviewing people in Moscow, the Leslies, who are the descendants of Leslie, one of the great soldiers Leslie from the 17th century. They know their family history because they've written it down over the years, and they're intensely proud of it.
Well, language is another big area for you. What would be the language that they spoke then? If you were a Scot, I mean, I don't know, would it be essentially Broad Scots at that stage?
At that time, the 17th century, they would have spoken Broad Scots, but they would have also spoken Latin as a lingua franca.
So would that be what the Russians, how they could converse with Russians?
To some extent, with intellectuals, they would communicate often in Latin, but they had a link. That attitude that we've got now, that the world should learn English, didn't exist in those days. So you've got brilliant Scottish linguists, intellectuals who learned other languages and became fluent in them. So like people like Patrick Gordon learned Russian. And I mean, one of the great sources of Russian history in the 17th century is the Patrick Gordon diaries,
Mm-hmm. Sure, I read once that even Wallace actually, would be able to speak French. I think it's French, possibly Latin, or Latin, possibly Greek as well, because that, Greek would come up from time to time. So, this was a sort of monoglot thing that we have nowadays.
Didn't exist in those days. We're a multilingual nation, and one of the great contributions. I'm also doing work on Scottish missionaries. This is the Mary Slessor centenary, and I'm giving a talk as part of that in Dundee. And again, one of their great contributions was, for example, I came across a Scotsman called Henry Brunton in one of the first Scottish missionary efforts in West Africa, in what's now Sierra Leone, in the 1770s, 1780s from memory. And he was one of the first people to delineate and to write down the language Susu, the language of this part of West Africa. And astonishingly, about 30, 40 years later, I'm looking at the Scottish mission in an area called Circassia, the North Caucasus, where the Tsars gave Scottish missionaries from Edinburgh some huge amount of acres of land to establish Presbyterianism in among the Muslim tribes. Yeah. And I think their philosophy was, well, see what happens, boys. So they established this area. And Henry Brunton, who'd been in West Africa, appears in the North Caucasus. And again, he works on the Tartar Turkish language and is one of the first people to write it down and create a grammar of it. And these are huge contributions these men have made to the culture of these areas. And also in that Circassian area, there's a great story where a man called Mackenzie Wallace from the Times newspaper goes through the area about 50 years after the failure of the mission. And he reads on the map Sherlandskaya Colonia, Scottish colony, and he goes and he's told that the patriarch of the village will help him if there is anything to know. And he asked this old gentleman dressed in black and with a black beard if there were any Scots in the area. And the man replied in Russian, "Why do you want to know?" And Mackenzie Wallace said, "Because I'm a Scot myself." And he broke into broad Scots, the Circassian, and said, "Did you ever hear tell of the great Edinburgh doctor, who was his father?" And again, this old man had been a boy who was bought out of slavery from the tribes and educated and became the patriarch of the village. So there are amazing stories like that.
We seem to be some folk for leaving our own shores, aren't we? I mean,
well, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of the reasons I want Scotland to be independent is I want us to have the choice of leaving our own shores. Yeah. I've got kids all over the world, and I would love them to have the choice of coming back to Scotland. And working here
that's one of the big issues is the outward migration. And especially to London, essentially, I think. However, you mentioned Mary Slessor. I mean, I was brought up in a Presbyterian home in the Borders, and one of the things we did was we knew all about the World Mission. We did, sales of work and stuff at Sunday school, which was about countries like Malawi, raising funds to help folk in Africa. And we were taught about Livingstone was a huge figure in my youth. And Mary Slessor fits into this, doesn't she?
She's a unique character. She was a working class woman who worked as a half-timer in the mills. In my lifetime, I interviewed Dundee half-timers, women who, as wee girls, 13, 12-year-old, had worked in the mills half the day and went to school half the day. Well, that's what Mary Slessor did. But in her 20s, she got religion and she evangelised in the slums of Dundee, but then her heart took her to Calabar, West Africa, an area devastated by the slave trade.
Was that quite unusual for a female at that time, for a woman to do that or not? I mean, because the stories about the jute mills in Dundee is laden with stories of women, strong women,
absolutely,
feisty women. Yeah,
the men were the kettle boilers; they were the wage earners. So it's natural somebody with that strength could come out of Dundee. There were a lot of middle-class ladies went as missionaries, but not so many working-class girls. And that's what gave Mary an ability to empathise with local people. I mean, she did go native. She went against Victorian traditions, very much so. She lived in mud huts, and she was against a lot of the taboos that had grown up in the area. So I've interviewed, for example, Mary Slessor's great-granddaughters. Now, Mary didn't have any children, but she saved a lot of people who, because of taboos against twins, one of them must have been sired by the devil, and you didn't know which.
So you killed the child?
So you killed both children.
Both?
She saved them. And so I interviewed. Another taboo was if a mother died in childbirth, the child was to blame. And again, they were allowed to die in the forest. So Mary had a network of spies, literally, who heard about these incidents, and she got these children and raised them as her own. So I interviewed the grandchildren of these people, who again were so proud of their Presbyterian and Scottish heritage, and recording in Duketown Parish Church, a very powerful image of, in Presbyterian churches, you're introduced as somebody from out with the community. And I was prepared to be introduced, but they actually handed me a microphone and asked me to justify my existence. And when I mentioned the word Mary Slessor, you could feel this wave of love come towards you because of Mary Slessor and the reputation she had. So my image of the missionary was, I used to sit in the African history classes at Edinburgh University, Chris Fife and George Shipperson, two of the great African historians. And my image of missionaries was of people tramping on local cultures and part of the imperial. But Mary Slessor blew that. And in Malawi too, the number of people he spoke to from elites in Africa who'd been educated in Scottish mission schools and who praised again that democratic intellectual tradition. The fact that the Scots didn't have any idea of people being inferior in any way and were taught the same curriculum. And even people who eventually became dubious characters like Dr. Banda in Malawi, he compared and contrasted the Scots and the Dutch even, and said the Scots educated our people, the Dutch ignored us.
But was it not part of the missionary tradition, though, that you were taking your knowledge and God's word to inferior people, essentially? Was that not very much the case? They were uneducated and hadn't had the word of God. It kind of implied, did it not?
Well, I think it was more, for people like Mary Slessor and Laws of Livingstonia, I think it was the word of God that was the important thing. Perhaps the political backup that came in later from the British government had more of that attitude. And scientific racism did exist in the late 19th century. So, but again, I'm proud that within that, for example, Lovedale College in South Africa was a beacon of education for black and white. And Fort Hare University that developed out of it, once apartheid came in, was where Nelson Mandela and people like that were educated. And again, there was quite a strong egalitarian Presbyterian ethic within these institutions.
But were we not in a way, or were they not in a way, preparing the way for colonialisation, exploitation? I mean, from the empire. I mean, to bring goods, services back to our country.
Yes, it was ultimately the British government wanted to exploit these places, but people like Kenneth Kaunda said that David Livingstone was Africa's first freedom fighter. Now that contrasts dramatically with the image that people like Neil Ferguson, right-wing historians, would give us, that they were part of an imperial project. When you have African nationalists saying that they weren't, and in Malawi, I remember Andrew Ross, Reverend Andrew Ross, who was a biographer for Livingstone, telling me that ANC in Malawi and the Kirk session that he belonged to were one and the same. And they took the format from the Presbyterian Kirk session into the African National Congress meetings. So there was a crossover. And a British official, I forget his name, said that the Scots missionaries were Her Majesty's official opposition in Malawi, what became Malawi, in Nyasaland as it was.
Yeah.
So there is a strong egalitarian, non-imperialist tradition within these Scots missionaries as well.
And not just Presbyterian either, because I mean, since then we've had a lot of Catholic charity work being done from Scotland.
Yes.
There's Skiaf
Yes.
is a fantastic kind of international advert for Scotland, I always think. And also, Catholic schools collecting money to go to Africa. So there is a kind of, quite a long tradition of doing that.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. What else are you up to? You're always interested in food and drink. You're always talking about clarets and the like.
I'm doing well. Two other talks that I'm giving is one on knee deep in claret, which might be in the cellar of Linlithgow Palace, which would be a great place to do it. Definitely one in the National Library for the Year of Food and Drink, and one on Don Roberto on R.B. Cunninghame Graham for the R.B. Cunninghame Graham Society, which is in Glasgow, in Babbity Bousters in about a month's time.
Give us a little bit about Cunninghame Graham, because I mean this is a formative figure, and we were talking about the independence referendum, but in Scottish nationalism and making coherence out of the idea of a Scottish nation.
Well, he was the founder of the National Party, the forerunner of the SNP, along with Hugh MacDiarmid and various intellectuals. But his background is he had Spanish blood. He had estates near Loch Lomond at Gartmore and the Firth of Clyde. And he spent 7 gap years as a gaucho in Argentina. And all his gaucho gear is in
this
sterling.
Sounds like a World Cup story to me.
It's fantastic. Larger than life figure. I mean, I identify with him totally. And my daughter spent her gap year in Western Argentina, and she was given a present of a book called El Escocese Errante, The Wandering Scot, the life of R.B. Cunninghame Graham, where he's greatly revered.
And he's called, was it Don Roberto?
Don Roberto was his nickname. But in that introduction to the book, it says in Spanish that this was a man who, across South America, was just simply known by the name Don Roberto. He was such a famous character because he was a great writer in the Victorian era, and he wrote about gaucho culture, one of the first people to expose gaucho culture to the outside world. But he also He founded the Labour Party with Keir Hardie, but then he founded the SNP, which is why the Labour Party hate him with a vengeance, and have tried to kind of suppress knowledge of him. But he's in the original Scottish Labour Party pledge cards with Keir Hardie, and fought along with Keir Hardie for workers' rights, was arguably the first socialist in the UK Parliament. But during the referendum campaign, there's this wonderful quote from Don Roberto, which I used often in the referendum campaign. And I used it again recently when I was asked to give a talk about Don Roberto to quite a prestige gathering. And in the audience, sitting about 5 rows from the front, was George Robertson. And I used this quote, and I was thinking of George when I used it. And it's a quote where Cunninghame Graham blew the whole idea of Scottish nationalism being anti-English. The quote is something like, "The enemies of Scottish nationalism are not the English, for they were ever a great and noble people, quick to respond when justice calls. Our enemies are here among us, born without imagination." Which I think is a fantastic quotation.
And you aimed that at Lord Robertson?
I looked at Lord Robertson, and he had the good grace to say how much he had enjoyed the talk, except for the last 5 minutes.
It's fantastic, all these sort of great characters from Scottish history, isn't it? Just amazing. And your other thing, of course, is you say food and drink. I mean, that was the Scots who were, a lot of them went over to Bordeaux, didn't they, to organise the, bringing back the wine. But this is the year of food and drink, isn't it?
The government has designated this the year of food and drink. And what I say is that, fine, we've got this fantastic Scottish produce, but you're not going to drink elderberry wine with it. You need to drink fine wine with fine food. So I'm trying to get them interested in combining this great tradition of Scots in the wine trade, along with the year of food and drink. So I'm certainly giving a couple of talks in the subject. I wrote a book called Knee Deep in Claret with Callan MacLean, who was a Gaelic-speaking skianach and with great knowledge of Gaelic culture, and I was a Scots-speaking lowlander. We both spoke French, so we got the kind of material that a lot of people wouldn't get, and it's a rich read, and it's a great hobby and subject of mine.
But are you trying to promote some other connection between France and Scotland through this, or the wine trade, some new avenue for...
No, it's just
more wine to Scotland.
Well, we need more. Upstarts like you prefer Burgundy to Claret, but I'm a good Scottish traditionalist. Claret, good Claret best keeps you the cold, as Alan Ramsay. Or there's a great line even earlier by William Dunbar, which is fresh to drink with us the new fresh wine that grew upon the river o' Rhine, then fresh, fragrant clarets out of France, of Angers and Orleans, with many a course of great dainty, say ye, amen, for charity. So that's him describing the wines that were available in Stirling and in Holyrood Palace in Linlithgow as well, back in the 15th, 16th century.
So it would just be run-of-the-mill, though, would it not, for a long time for Scots to drink? I mean, it's what you would, a fairly poor Scot would drink in a bar or something, wouldn't it? In an inn? Would drink wine,
yes.
Wasn't just fine wines.
No.
A bit like some of our food today, like we talk about oysters, but oysters were something that you could pick up and eat.
That's right. They were a staple of Edinburgh in the 18th century, certainly. Yeah, Scots drank wine from the days of the Old Alliance, where they were given privileges in the wine trade, and that began them importing it, right through and beyond the Act of Union. It became a symbol of Scottishness during the 18th century, when the English government tried to, and the new British government tried to impose their Francophobia. They had gone over to port as their national drink, had ditched claret, but because of the Old Alliance tradition, Scottish Jacobites especially toasted the king o'er the water in good French claret. And there's a lovely epigram by John Hume, which sums up the state in the 18th century where the Scots were resisting going away from claret. And it goes, "Firm and erect the Caledonian stood, old was his mutton and his claret good. Let them drink port, the English statesman cried. He drank the poison and his spirit died." But very few of them died because they smuggled it in huge quantities. So they continued a kind of defiance in the claret drinking tradition right through the 18th century, until eventually it was industrialisation and the temperance movement in the 19th century that kind of killed off it as an active mass tradition, and then it was only the elites that continued it.
Okay. Okay, Bill, we'll have to leave it there. It's great to talk to you again, and maybe one day soon we'll be able to toast our independence in Bordeaux.
Here's to that.